D5. Chapter 3. Port. Port is a sweet, fortified wine hailing from the Douro region of Portugal. It originates from trade wars between England and France in the 17th century, causing England to increase trade with Portugal. The powerful red wines became popular in England, and brandy started to be added to stabilize the dry wines and make sure they arrived in England in good condition. The practice of fortifying the wine during fermentation started when two British merchants visited the Abbot of Lamego and found the sweet wines made there were of higher quality than the dry wines they had seen anywhere else, and shipped the entire stocks to England. At the time, a number of the famous port shippers were established, including Kopke, War, Croft, Quarles Harris, and Taylors. Traditionally, shippers were agents that took a commission for shipping port abroad or acquired port from brokers in the Douro and then stored them in lodges, wine cellars or warehouses, in Vila Nova de Gaia, located on the opposite side of the mouth of the river Douro in Porto, prior to onward shipping overseas. However, most shippers have since become producers and have become dominant players in the production of port with their own vineyards, wineries, and bottling facilities. The signing of the Methuen Treaty in 1703 ensured that Portuguese wines received lower rates of duty in England than those of any other country. Port's popularity led to the production of large amounts of poor-quality port-style wines, using poor-quality spirit, thin wines, and bolstering color with additions such as elderberry juice. Poor quality meant that demand slumped, leading to oversupply and falling grape and wine prices. In action against this, in 1756, the port vineyards were officially demarcated, and production regulations drawn up by the Prime Minister of the time, the Marquês de Pombal. At the same time, Pombal created the Campanha Geral de Agricultura das Vinas do Alto Douro, often referred to as Real Campanha Vela, sorry for the pronunciation, from which all ports for export had to be bought. The Campania was also empowered to fix prices and was given the exclusive right to supply the spirit used in fortification. Although a number of the decrees passed by the Pombal were far from popular, sales volumes and prices of port began to rise once again. The early 19th century was challenging as the Douro and wider Portugal suffered through the Peninsular Wars and Portuguese Civil War. Later in the century, the vineyards were hit by both mildew and then phylloxera, and many small growers and producers needed to sell their land and properties in order to survive. The shippers took advantage of low prices and started to own vineyards and quintas, estates. The first half of the 20th century saw the creation of the Instituto do Vinho do Porto, IVP 1933, responsible for the administration and supervision of the port industry, and the Casa do Douro 1932, a secondary authority to supervise the growers within the port demarcation. Just after this time, vineyard parcels in the Douro were rated A through I based on their suitability for producing port, a classification that remains today. The Casa do Douro and then the IVP also controlled the purchase of the spirit aguardente with which producers could fortify their wines. A number of other influential developments occurred at the end of the 20th century and start of the 21st. In the early 1980s, the World Bank scheme offered low-interest loans to Douro growers who could plant or replant up to 10 hectares of vineyard provided that the land was classified as being of either A or B grade, and that only 5 prescribed varieties were used. Some of the major shippers, including Coburn's, Ferreria, and Ramos Pinto, together with the local university, joined to fund a vineyard research program. Around 2,500 hectares of vineyards were planted on wider terraces called patamares and with blocks of the prescribed varieties, compared to the usual field blend. In 1986, Portugal entered the EU, and as a consequence, by 1991, producers were permitted to source and buy their own aguardente on the open market, leading to a rise in quality in the spirit used and hence a port overall. In 1990, the Casa do Douro controversially bought 40% of the shares in one of the largest shippers of the time, Royal Oporto. Although it was claimed that this would allow growers to trade their own products, the venture was not a success, and a few years later, the Casa do Douro became bankrupt. In 2003, a new interprofessional body, the Instituto de Vinos do Porto e do Douro, IVDP, was created to supervise both port and Douro wine producers, reflecting the growing importance of dry Douro wines alongside port. In the first decades of the 21st century, developments have continued to be made. An improved version of the Patamares has been developed. Despite a continued focus on the 5 prescribed varieties, other local grape varieties are increasingly being noted and used for the characteristics that they can bring to a blend. Depopulation in the vineyard areas has meant that the labor-intensive traditional practice of foot treading in the winery has been largely superseded. As the new technology has been improved, it is now used for wines of all levels of quality. 3.1. The growing environment and grape growing. Location and climate. The Douro region is located on the northeast of Portugal. The total area of the appellation covers 250,000 hectares, of which around 43,000 hectares are planted, and 32,000 hectares of these register for Dio Porto, the production of port wines. It has a warm continental climate with temperatures easily reaching 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer, and freezing temperatures are not unusual in the winter. Distance from the Atlantic Ocean combined with shelter from the Serra do Maranhão to the west of the region mean that the vineyard area is much warmer and drier than the cities of Porto and Vila Nova de Gaia on the coast, 70 kilometers from the western end of the vineyard area. The vineyard area follows the path of the River Douro and is divided into 3 sub-regions: Baixo Corgo, Cima Corgo, and Douro Superior. The most westerly of the regions, the Baixo Corgo, is the coolest and wettest, 900 millimeters of rainfall per annum, being nearest the cold Atlantic coast. With its cooler climate, the Baixo Corgo tends to produce fruit from many of the inexpensive ruby and tawny ports. The Cima Corgo is warmer and drier, around 700 millimeters of rainfall per annum, and most of the well-known producers have vineyards in this region, which are used to produce age-indicated tawny port and vintage ports. By comparison, the Douro Superior, which is furthest from the coast, is the hottest and driest sub-region, with only 450 milliliters of rainfall per annum, and drought is a frequent issue. The Douro Superior is still relatively sparsely planted, but as it contains some flatter lands which allow for mechanization, plantings are increasing. Although the region is divided very generally into these 3 areas, the winding River Douro and its tributaries provides a range of microclimates. Vineyard sites vary widely in altitude and aspect, meaning that there can be differences in average temperature and sunlight exposure even within a single vineyard. Soils. The stony, shallow soils of the Douro are free-draining and poor in nutrients, which limits vigor. The underlying bedrock is schist, a type of rock that crumbles into layers relatively easily. Due to ancient tectonic movements, the schist in the area splits into vertical layers rather than the more typical horizontal, and therefore vine roots are able to penetrate deep into the bedrock to find water. Irrigation is only permitted in exceptional circumstances, for example, periods of drought under which the vine could be in extreme hydric stress. Therefore, what little natural water there is the main source of water for the vine. The schist is so important in the viability of grape growing in this region that the boundary of the demarcated port region mostly follows the outline of the schist. It is very difficult for vines to survive if planted above the impenetrable granite bedrock that is common in the wider area. Vineyard layout and management. The steep slopes of the Douro Valley, many with gradients over 30%, mean that viable vineyard layouts are limited. 3 types of vineyard layout are in place in the Douro. Socolos. This is the traditional method. Socolos are narrow terraces supported by walls of dry bedrock. They allow for planting densities of around 6,000 vines per hectare. This layout is typically not suitable for mechanization, plus labor is required to maintain the walls. and for this reason, socolos are not usually considered when planting a new vineyard. The socolos of the Douro are protected by UNESCO, and for that reason cannot be converted to any other layouts. The vines on the socolos can be planted at lower densities to allow for a small tractor to enter the terraces to reduce so much need for labor. Patamares. These are terraces supported by a steep earth ramp rather than a stone wall. Small tractors are able to run up and down the slopes by the use of tracks that run diagonally up the slope. Patamares are cheaper to implement and maintain than socolos. However, erosion and the growth of weeds on the ramps can be problematic. Planting densities are relatively low, around 3,000 to 3,500 vines per hectare, as the ramps take up a lot of space. There are two kinds of patamares. Large, wide patamares that support 2 rows of vines on each terrace. These were the original form of patamares, constructed when the bulldozers that create the terraces were large and bulky. Although growing 2 rows of vines on each terrace makes efficient use of vineyard land, uneven ripeness can be an issue, with the exterior row of vines gaining more sun exposure. Narrow patamares that only support 1 row of vines. These are a more modern version, carved by newer, smaller bulldozers, and often laser technology, ensuring precise construction. These patamares are often tilted very slightly towards the slope and also from one side of the terrace to the other, both of which improve water absorption and drainage and reduce erosion. With only 1 row of vines per terrace, uneven ripeness is less of a problem. Viña ao alto. In this layout option, the vines are planted in vertical rows up the slopes. It is the least expensive option to plant and maintain and allows for relatively high density planting of around 5,000 vines per hectare and hence efficient use of land. However, above a 40% incline, mechanization cannot be used, and therefore patamares are more likely to be used in these cases. Water runoff and erosion can also be significant problems. Use of this vineyard layout is currently relatively limited. Vines are cordon trained and spur pruned, or head trained and cane pruned, and VSP trellised to promote even sun exposure and ripening and allow for mechanization where viable. Summer pruning, such as leaf removal, may be used to ensure sun exposure throughout the growing season, especially for late ripening varietals. Rootstocks that are tolerant of drought, generally 110R and 1103P, both of which are hybrids of V. rupestris and V. berlandierii, are widely used. When vineyards are replanted, key focuses are increasing vine density, vineyard layouts that allow mechanization, and selecting the best planting material, grape variety, rootstock, etc., for that area of land. This may even mean planting different grape varieties on the same terrace. The maximum yield permitted for port wine production is 55 hectoliters per hectare. But due to limited water availability, and in some years, the hazards and diseases described below, yields are more likely to be around 30 hectoliters per hectare. Viticultural hazards can include late spring frosts in the highest altitude vineyards, and in some cool years, wet weather from the west during the early summer, which disrupts flowering and fruit set. Downy mildew and botrytis bunch-rot can be issues, especially in the wetter Baixo Corgo. These are combated by canopy management techniques and spraying with fungicides. Fertilizers may be used as necessary to improve the poor nutrient status of the soil. Herbicides may be required to control weeds that grow on the slopes of the patamares, which can compete with the vines for water and nutrients. However, if there is enough space, a small mower may be used. Cover crops may be grown on Viña ao alto slopes to prevent erosion, improve soil structure and nutrition, and reduce the presence of weeds. A number of the largest growers and producers are increasingly farming using sustainable or organic techniques where and when it is possible to do so. Harvesting is carried out by hand. Much of the vineyard topography is not suitable for machine harvesters. An aging regional population and continuing depopulation is fast catching up with growers who each year face increasing difficulty in finding enough people to pick. Symington Family Estates, itself the largest single grower in the region, has been developing since 2015 a suitable machine harvester to ensure that, if labor sourcing becomes too difficult, they will still be able to harvest their fruit. The harvest tends to start in the Douro Superior and end in the Baixo Corgo. The various microclimates within the valley, the use of different grapes, and the prevalence of hand harvesting, relatively slow, means that harvest can be spread over several weeks. Grape varieties. There are over 100 grape varieties permitted for the production of port. Since the 1980s, 5 prescribed varieties have been the focus of replanting efforts and clonal research: Touriga Franca, Tinta Roriz, Tinta Barroca, Touriga Nacional, and Tinto Sal. However, many small vineyard owners continue to plant in the ways that have been carried out for centuries, and therefore the many of the vineyards in the Douro are planted with a field blend. Furthermore, a number of producers are looking at varieties outside the prescribed 5, particularly if they can make valuable contributions to the blend, such as color and acidity. And research is focused on maintaining the diversity of indigenous plantings and investigating their future potential, with the effects of climate change particularly in mind. The vast majority of port wines are made from a blend of varieties to make use of their differing characteristics and reduce vintage variation, e.g., cool, wet years may disrupt some grape varieties more than others. As stated above, a number of vineyards are made up of a mix of grape varieties, a field blend. As the various grape varieties planted in the Douro have different ripening times, a field blend can provide a different character to blocks of different varieties that are all picked at optimum ripeness and then blended. The fruit from old vines, Vina Vela, is generally a key part of the blend in premium and super premium port wines, and some port shippers make wines exclusively from old vine fruit. Black varieties. The most important varieties for volume and/or quality are listed. Touriga Franca, a late ripening variety, making it suitable for growing in the warmest sites, with low altitude and south facing. It has tight bunches of thick-skinned grapes, which makes it relatively resistant to fungal diseases. However, it can be vigorous, and this needs to be managed, usually by summer pruning. It contributes color, tannin, and acidity, as well as juicy red and black fruit flavors and floral aromas to a blend. For these reasons, it is popular with growers and port producers, and it is by far the most grown variety. Tinta Roriz, also known as Tempranillo in Spain and Aragones elsewhere in Portugal. Early ripening variety that is best grown in relatively cool sites, as otherwise it can suffer from water stress. It can lend body and deep color to the blend. It is capable of producing high yields, but these need to be limited, otherwise the wines can lack concentration. Tinta Barroca, an early ripening variety that is best planted coolest sites, high altitude or north-facing slopes, generally in the Baixo Corgo and Cima Corgo. Otherwise, it is prone to heat damage and grape shriveling. It is not as floral as some of the other grapes, with flavors that tend to be more earthy. Unless planted in the coolest sites, it can lack acidity, and its color also tends to fade more quickly than wines from Touriga Nacional and Touriga Franca. It is capable of producing high yields of grapes. Touriga Nacional, a mid-ripening variety with thick-skinned grapes, producing wines with deep color intensity and high levels of tannins. It retains acidity well and displays concentrated flavors of black fruit and floral aromas. Its wines are said to have long aging potential, and hence it is often a component of the premium, long-matured wines. It can suffer from excess vegetative vigor, which needs to be managed through summer pruning, and is susceptible to coulure, which can lower its yield substantially and cause vine imbalance. Tinta Amarela, Trincaderia in other parts of Portugal. Prone to fungal diseases due to its tight bunches of grapes, produces full-bodied wines with concentrated black fruits and spicy notes that are approachable in youth, but are also capable of aging. Tinto Sal, a low-yielding variety that produces small, thick-skinned grapes that are resistant to fungal disease. It ripens late and is very tolerant of heat. It produces concentrated wines with high acidity and the capacity to age well. Susao, a thick-skinned variety becoming increasingly popular for its deep intensity of color and ability to retain high levels of acidity. White varieties. The key white grapes for port production are Malvasia fina, known as Boal in Madeira, produces neutral wines with medium acidity, full body, and a slightly honeyed characteristic. Muscatel Gallego Branco, or Muscat Blanc à Petit Grains, an aromatic grape in port production often used for unaged styles. Section 3.2, Winemaking, Fermentation and Extraction. In port production, fermentation is stopped by the addition of grape spirit to create a sweet wine, usually 80 to 120 grams per liter of residual sugar. The maceration with the skins lasts for a maximum of 2 days, and therefore extraction techniques need to be very effective. The key methods of extraction during the fermentation include foot treading in lagares. Lagares are shallow, around 80 centimeters deep, square tanks, allowing a large surface area between the must and grape skins. Traditionally, they were made from granite, and the extraction would come from foot treading. Foot treading is effective at extracting, but at the same time gentle enough not to crush the seeds, which would release bitter tannins. This is still the method used for a small number of premium and super premium ports. Modern lagares, also called robotic lagares, more recently, modern lagares have been created in which silicone feet are attached to a stainless steel gantry, press the grapes against the lagar floor, and subsequently punch down the cap. The advantage of modern lagares is that they reduce the need for a large hired workforce, which can be difficult to obtain and unreliable. However, the initial investment for this equipment is higher. Modern lagares can produce wines of equal quality to those that are produced by foot treading, although some producers continue to use foot treading for their most expensive wines. Pumping over. This technique is the same as that used for non-fortified wines. Although this technique can produce ports with deep color and high levels of concentration through frequent pumping over, it is not as effective at extracting as foot treading or modern lagares. Stainless steel pistons. This technique uses open stainless steel vats with pistons that punch down the cap to a programmed schedule. This can be used in conjunction with pumping over, which is usually needed to promote a more even extraction. This technique is believed to be almost as effective at extracting as lagares and seems to produce wines that are very similar in quality to those that have been made by foot treading in lagares. Auto vinifiers. These sealed concrete or stainless steel tanks provide a solution to cap management that does not require electricity. The rising pressure of the CO2 produced from the fermentation pushes the juice up through pipes into a holding tank. When the pressure of the CO2 reaches a certain level, a valve is automatically released and the wine in the holding tank, no longer supported by the gas pressure, sprays over the cap. The key advantage of this technique is that it does not require electricity and therefore can be one of the cheapest options. However, because the process is reliant on CO2 released from the fermentation, very little extraction occurs before the fermentation starts. This means that the wines that this technique tends to produce are lighter in color, body, and flavor, suitable for basic tawny, white, and ruby ports. Modern fermentation vessels, including those used in modern lagares, tend to be made from stainless steel. This allows for easy temperature control and means that if necessary, the tank can be cooled to slow the fermentation and therefore prolong the period of extraction. Stainless steel also has the advantage of being easy to clean. Some producers use granite, concrete, or old wooden vessels, usually for small volume wines. The grapes may or may not be destemmed. Unripe stems can impart bitterness. However, if stems are fully ripe, they can aid pressing, reducing compaction of the pomace by enabling better drainage, after the fermentation has been stopped and free-run wine drained. Fermentation temperatures for red wines tend to be 28 to 32 degrees Celsius, or 82 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Warm enough to allow sufficient extraction, but not so warm that the fermentation progresses too quickly and reduces the available extraction time before pressing and fortification. Fermentation temperatures for white ranges from around 17 to 22 degrees Celsius, 63 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. For further details, see white port. Many producers use ambient yeast for fermentation, as these are sufficient to start the ferment, and completing fermentation to dryness is not a concern for port production. Fortification. Port legislation states that the spirit used to fortify the wine must come from grapes or other grape-derived products, and it must be of 77% ABV plus or minus 0.5%. This spirit is typically called aguardiente. Most styles of port must be fortified to an alcoholic strength between 19 to 22% ABV. An exception is made for basic ruby, tawny, white, and rosé port that can be fortified to a minimum of 18% ABV. The alcoholic strength of the aguardiente is relatively low compared to the 95 to 96% ABV spirits used in many other fortified wines. Whereas 95 to 96% ABV spirit is neutral, 77% ABV has more character and is the reason port displays spirity aromas. Also, because of its relatively low alcoholic strength, a significant amount of spirit, approximately 1 liter of spirit for every 4 liters of fermenting must, needs to be added to produce a fortified wine of 20% ABV, and therefore it is not surprising that the style and quality of the fortifying spirit has a significant influence on the style and quality of the wine. From 1967 to 1976, all producers had to buy their aguardiente from the Casa Deodoro. From 1976, the IVP tendered the contract for the spirit. The aguardiente was the same for all producers, and it was not of particularly high quality, cheap alcohol from southern Portugal and then France. However, since 1991, producers have been able to source and buy their own aguardiente. In the years that have passed since this time, port producers have gained a better understanding of the role of the aguardiente, and many use slightly different spirits in different wines. Although all spirit must be 77% ABV, some producers will use relatively neutral spirits to best show the character of the wine, whereas others will use spirits that are more aromatic, have more fruity esters, to add a certain character to their port. The spirit chosen will also have an influence on the price of the final wine. Therefore, high-quality spirit will be added to premium wines, whereas less expensive spirit will be used in inexpensive wines. The fermentation is stopped when the wine reaches around 5 to 7% ABV and depends on the concentration of sugar the producer wants to retain in the final wine, generally 80 to 120 grams per liter. This can be a function of house style. The wine is drained from the skins before the aguardiente is added. This means that draining must be as efficient as possible, as the must will continue fermenting during this time until the fortifying alcohol is added, using up sugar that may be desired in the final wine. Modern fermentation vessels, including modern lagares, are generally designed to drain as quickly as possible compared to traditional granite lagares, which can take hours to drain. The mass of grape skins left after draining will be pressed, and much of this pressed wine will be blended into the fortified free-run wine to provide greater color and tannin necessary for wines that are to undergo long periods of aging. The grapes for port are picked when the flavors and tannins are ripe. Too much potential alcohol is not an issue for these wines, but acidity can be low and pH high, and therefore acidification is common. Ports do not go through malolactic conversion, as lactic acid bacteria are unable to tolerate the high concentration of alcohol in the wine after fortification. All ports spend their first winter in the Douro. During the months that follow fermentation, the wines are left to clarify before they are racked off the gross lees. A rotary vacuum filter is often used to extract the remaining wine from the lees. In the spring, the wines may be shipped from wineries in the vineyard areas to lodges in Vila Nova de Gaia. Blending is a key part of the production process and may happen at any point. Ports are generally blends of different vineyard parcels, different grape varieties, though through co-fermentation of different varieties is quite common. And depending on the style, different vintages. Lots that have been treated differently in the winery may also be kept separate and used as blending options. For example, port producers will generally make a range of young wines with some very high levels of sweetness and some that are drier specifically to adjust levels of sweetness in the final wine style. Many ports are non-vintage products, with consumers expecting consistency of style year on year. Blending wines, usually including those from different vintages, is an important process to ensure this consistency. Port producers also tend to have a house style, and hence blending can be used to achieve this style throughout the wines within the shipper's range. Blending is also important for producing a wine of the right profile and quality for the style it is to become. For example, wines destined for vintage port will have deeper color, greater concentration of flavors, and higher tannins to be able to undergo extensive aging, compared to a reserve ruby or LBV. All of these factors mean that the more stock a shipper holds, the easier it is for them to create a range of different styles. Smaller producers may limit their ranges to certain styles of wines to ensure they can produce such styles with consistency. Maturation. The climate of Villanova de Gaia is better suited to the maturation of port wines than the wineries in the vineyard area. With strong Atlantic influence, the temperatures are generally cooler and more constant. However, as Villanova de Gaia has become more tourist-focused and congested, gradually more producers have built well-insulated, humidity-controlled lodges in the vineyard area. Most styles of port are aged in oak, even if for a relatively short time. Vessels may vary considerably in size depending on the amount of oxidation desired. The largest, called balseros, are vats that can hold 100,000 liters. These are generally used to store wines and keep them fresh. If gentle oxidation is desired, the wines are usually matured in 600-liter barrels called pipes. The aromas of new oak are not wanted, and therefore new vessels will be used to produce unfortified wines for a few years before they are used for port maturation. Racking is carried out during maturation process to remove lees that gradually accumulates at the bottom of the vessel to avoid potential off flavors. The frequency of racking is another way the producer can control the amount of oxidation, as is the degree to which the vessels are topped up with wine. The maturation process is key to the style of port produced, and therefore more on maturation will be covered in the next section. Section 3.3, Styles of Port. Port is available in a diversity of styles, qualities, and prices, mainly determined by the quality of the base wine and the form of maturation. Minimum amounts of aging are often legally defined, and many of the wines in these different categories must be analyzed and tasted by the IVDP before being permitted to specify the wine style on the label. Quality-minded producers will often start making decisions on what grapes will be used in particular styles of wine during the growing season. Much is dependent on the weather, but the producers can also have an impact on ripeness and concentration of the grapes through canopy management techniques and harvesting dates. Once in the winery, the different parcels of grapes may be treated differently depending on the style of wine to which they are suited. For example, extraction will usually be relatively gentle on the least ripe grapes so as not to extract any underripe tannins or flavors, and this wine is therefore best suited to less concentrated styles such as basic tawny. Red ports, basic ruby. Basic ruby port is medium-bodied with medium tannin levels and often mixture of red and black fruit flavors. It is generally the product of wines that are suitable for drinking early and have not suitable aging potential. For example, they may be fruity but without much tannin. Basic ruby port is usually produced using protective winemaking techniques to retain primary fruit flavors. This includes fermenting in stainless steel or concrete and aging the wines in bulk, usually in stainless steel or concrete, sometimes large old wooden vessels, for a maximum of 3 years. The wine is generally a blend of more than 1 year and is expected to have the same consistent taste year on year. These wines are generally acceptable to good in quality and inexpensive to mid-priced. Due to limited aging and use of cheap spirit, both of which mean that it can be made at low price points, the wines often have simple fruity flavors and can have slightly harsh alcohol. Basic tawny. These wines may show some lightness and browning of color in common with other tawny ports. However, this does not tend to come from long periods of oxidative aging. These wines are often aged for no longer than ruby ports. They are often made by light extraction during fermentation, similar to rosé ports, to give them a paler color reminiscent of an older wine. The fermenting must for basic tawny may be drained early, concentrating the remaining wine, which can be used to add more color and flavor to ruby ports. Reserve ruby and reserve tawny. Reserve ruby and reserve tawny are higher quality wines than basic ruby and tawny. Reserve tawnies must be aged in wood for a minimum of 6 years. There is no minimum aging period for reserve ruby ports. However, they must be tasted and approved by the IVDP's tasting panel. They tend to be more concentrated and of a higher quality and price than basic ruby. Tawny with an indication of age. These ports have been aged for long periods of time in wooden barrels. The barrels typically used and hold 620 to 640 liters. These vessels permit a controlled exposure to oxygen, and over time tannins soften, alcohol becomes more integrated, and primary flavors of fruit develop into tertiary flavors from fruit development, such as dried fruit, and oxidation, e.g. coffee, caramel, and walnut. The barrels are old and therefore do not contribute flavors of oak. Due to the long aging period, clarification and stabilization occurs naturally in barrel, and therefore these wines tend not to need filtration before bottling. An age of 10, 20, 30, or 40 years, and from 2022, now 50 years, can be stated on the label. The age specified is not the minimum amount of time the wine must be aged. Indeed, these wines are usually blends of more than one vintage, and this blend can be made up of wines that are younger and older than the age specified. Instead, the wine will be tasted by a panel within the IVDP and must be deemed to have the characteristics of a wine of that age. Within their long aging, the barrels need racking and topping up due to gradual evaporation of the wine, and this makes the production of age-indicated tawny ports relatively expensive compared to other styles of port. Age-indicated tawny ports have seen increased sales in the last few years, and as stocks of these wines are decreasing, prices are rising. In recent years, a subcategory has risen, namely very old, non-age indicated aged tawny. This started with the launch of Taylor's Scion, a tawny port of more than 150 years old. Some other shippers have now launched their own versions, such as Graham's Nez Oubli, dating from 1882. Given their rarity and long maturations, these wines sell at super premium prices. Colheita. Tawny ports that are made from the grapes from one vintage are called Colheita ports. They must be aged in small barrels for a minimum of 7 years before being bottled. The label must state the vintage of the wine as well as the year the wine was bottled. The shipper could bottle part of their Colheita wine in 1 year, providing it has at least 7 years old, and then bottle more in the following years according to demand. The wine in barrel can be topped up with other wine or spirit to avoid ullage. Colheita ports do not tend to be as expensive as vintage port. However, there are some shippers that hold small stocks of very old Colheita wines that can sell for super premium prices. Vintage. Vintage ports are wines from one declared vintage. Producers must register their intention to release a vintage port in the second year after harvest, and the young wine is approved by an IVDP tasting panel. Producers generally only declare a vintage port in years where their grapes and young wines are of exceptional quality. There are some years where the vast majority of port shippers will declare a vintage, such as 2011 and 2016. whereas in other years, the decision is more mixed, 2015. As well as considering quality, producers will decide to release according to market conditions. If there are 2 exceptional vintages in a row, which is rare, the producer must decide whether to declare both vintages, the second of which could take sales away from the first. As well as being the product of a very good vintage, the grapes will come from high-quality plots, often from the shipper's own vineyards. Some shippers create super premium wines from very select plots, usually of old vines. The original in this category being Quinta do Novals Nacional, produced from the fruit of old, ungrafted vines. Touriga Franca and Touriga Nacional are usually key components in the blend, giving color, tannin, and flavor concentration suitable for long-term aging. The level of extraction during fermentation will also reflect this aim. Various lots of these wines are then stored in large wooden vessels to avoid too much oxidation. The wines will be tasted over the period of the next 2 years to determine if a vintage can be declared and which lots may be suitable for vintage port. Wines that do not become vintage port after this period may become single quinta ports, LBV, crusted port, or even possibly a form of tawny. Vintage ports undergo a maximum of 3 years in large old wooden vessels before extensive bottle aging. Although the majority are bottled during the second spring after the harvest, hence after 18 to 20 months in wood. The small amount of oxygen exposure during this time ensures that stability of the color of the wine through anthocyanin-tannin bonding over its long aging. The wines are bottled without fining or filtration, which results in a heavy deposit of sediment on opening and pouring. Young vintage ports tend to be deep in color and full-bodied with high levels of tannins and a pronounced intensity of ripe black fruit and sometimes floral notes. As they age, they gradually develop flavors of dried fruit and forest floor. The tannins and alcohol become better integrated in the wine. They tend to be very good to outstanding in quality, and due to this quality, sell for premium and super premium prices. Given their limited time in wooden vessels and early release from the winery, these tend to be highly profitable wines for the producer. Single quinta. In years when the producer does not produce a vintage port, e.g., the weather has not been suitable to produce grapes of sufficient quality, they may produce a single quinta port. This is a wine from 1 year that is made from only the grapes of one estate, or quinta, that is stated on the label, e.g. Taylor's Quinta de Vargas and Graham's Quinta dos Malvelos. Crusted. This is a non-vintage port that is aged in wood for up to 2 years before being bottled without fining or filtration, and hence a deposit or crust forms in the bottle. The bottling date must appear on the label. Crusted port can be released at any time after bottling. However, after 3 years of bottle age, it can include the term bottle matured on the label. These wines can be similar in style to vintage port and have a considerable aging potential. They are usually good to very good in quality and mid-priced to premium. Late bottled vintage LBV. LBV ports are wines from a single year and must be bottled between 4 and 6 years after harvest. The fruit used for LBVs does not tend to be of the same quality as that for vintage ports, and this, together with longer aging before bottling, means that they are bottled ready to drink. Before bottling, the wine is usually stored in a large, old wooden vessel or stainless steel vat to avoid oxidation. Many LBV ports are filtered on bottling and therefore can be drunk without decanting being necessary. LBV ports tend to be good to very good in quality and usually mid-priced. They tend to have a little more intensity, body, and tannin than Ruby and Ruby Reserve. Some LBV wines are not filtered before bottling. These wines tend to be more full-bodied than filtered LBVs and benefit from bottle maturation. Many spend 4 to 5 years in wood, followed by a further few years in bottle before release. They tend to say unfiltered on the bottle to distinguish them from filtered LBVs, which is the more common category. Similar to crusted port, wines that have been aged for 3 years in bottle before release from the winery can be labeled with the term bottle matured. These wines tend to be very good quality and the highest quality wines that can taste similar to young vintage ports. They are usually mid-priced. Rosé port. Rosé port, also called pink port, was invented by Croft in the late 2000s. It is made from black grape varieties, with grapes that tend to come from the coolest areas, high altitudes, or from the Baixo Corgo. The must is left to macerate for only a few hours before draining the free-run juice and clarification. Some of the lightest pressed juice may also be used. Fermentation takes place at around 15 to 16 degrees Celsius, which is 59 to 61 degrees Fahrenheit, to retain red berry fruit aromas. The aguardiente must be used as neutral as possible and of a high quality so as not to stand out, given that this style has less intense flavors and usually little tannin compared to red ports. The wines are bottled soon after the fortification and released from the winery within a year. They tend to be inexpensive to mid-priced, and color and flavor profile depends on the producer. They range from pale pink orange to deep pink. White port. The varieties for white port are often scattered within mixed vineyards and therefore will be harvested at the same time, albeit separated from the black grapes. Where vineyard parcels are planted entirely to white varietals, these may be harvested first. White ports are made in a range of styles, with varying degrees of sweetness and oxidation. Some white ports are made in a fruity, unoxidized style. Muscatel tends to be one of the key grape varieties in the blend, lending aromatic, fruity, and floral notes. Once at the winery, the grapes are crushed. SO2 is added, and maceration may last a couple of hours at chilled temperatures to limit oxidation. The must is then drained and pressed, and the juice fermented off the skins at temperatures similar to those used for unfortified white wines, typically 17 to 18 degrees Celsius, 63 to 64 degrees Fahrenheit, to enhance and retain fruity aromas. The rind may be stored in either stainless steel or in very large old oak casks for a short period. These white ports are often lemon in color, tend to be medium-bodied, and have flavors of stone fruits or floral notes. At the other end of the spectrum, there are white ports that are made in a highly oxidized style. It is typical for Malvasia to be a key part of the blend, with its subtle flavors in youth becoming honeyed and nutty with age. These wines may spend slightly longer on their skins and be fermented at slightly warmer temperatures, 20 to 22 Celsius, 68 to 72 Fahrenheit, to extract more phenolics that will support the wine during the aging process. The wines are aged for several years in small casks, like premium tawny ports. These wines can be amber or even brown in color and will show flavors of caramel, citrus peel, dried stone fruits, and nuts. White ports can also be made with some slight oxidation from more limited aging in oak. They tend to still show fresh fruit but can gain a slight nuttiness. White ports can qualify for the same labeling terms as tawny ports. They can be labeled with the term reserve if they have been aged in wood for a minimum of 7 years. They can also be labeled with an indication of age of 10, 20, 30, or 40 years old if it's deemed to have the characteristics and taste of that age by the IVDP tasting panel. The wines can classify for colheita if the wine comes from a single vintage and is aged for a minimum of 7 years. Very old wines. In 2022, new categories for very old wines were approved: 50 years old for white and, as noted, for tawny, and very, very old, or VVO, or W, for wines over 80 years of age, for white and tawny. Section 3.4, Wine Law and Wine Business. Types of businesses engaged in production. Land ownership in the Douro is very fragmented. There are around 20,000 vineyard owners with an average of only 2.2 hectares each. Most sell their grapes to one of the medium or large producers or to a cooperative. Cooperatives produce around 20% of the wine in the region. Although they are permitted to sell wine under their own brands, the prominence of many shippers' brands means that most cooperatives sell their wines to producers. Brokers are often employed as part of the trading of grapes and wine. There are far fewer producers than there were, with only 30 to 35 producing significant volumes. There are 5 main groups of producers that make up 80% of sales by volume. Porto Cruz is the largest producer and owns the largest single brand, Gran Cruz, followed by Symington Family Estates, which owns Coburn's, Dow's, Graham's, and War's, among others. So Grape, Portugal's largest wine producer, is the 3rd largest. It owns Sandeman, Offaly, and Faria, as well as many non-port brands in Portugal and other countries. Next is the Fladgate Partnership that owns Taylor's, Fonseca, Croft, and Crone. And 5th is Sauvignius that owns Burmester, Barros, Calum, and Kopke. The IVDP. The IVDP was formed in 2003, succeeding the earlier IVP, to govern and represent the interests of wine producers in the Douro. This interprofessional body controls and supervises the production and trade of wines in the Douro, both unfortified wines and port. The IVDP has several responsibilities. Among these, it regulates the amount of port that can be produced in any one year, the beneficio, and holds the register of vineyards as well as companies involved in wine production and shipping. It also controls the volume of port that can be released onto the market in a year. This is set at a maximum of 1/3 of a shipper's total stocks. The IVDP also analyzes and tastes port wines to ensure they meet the specifications of the different legally defined port styles and has a role in the promotion of port and unfortified wines from the Douro Valley. The beneficio. The amount of port must, i.e. grape juice designated for port, that can be produced in a year is highly regulated in a system called the beneficio. Note that the term beneficio refers to both the amount of port must that can be produced and the system itself. Each vineyard parcel is classified in terms of its capacity to produce quality grapes for port, considering factors such as location, altitude, aspect, soil, and grape varieties planted. The vineyard parcel receives a numerical value for each of these factors, and the final total is used to give the parcel a letter. This means that 2 vineyards in neighboring locations, but planted with different grape varieties, would likely gain different scores and possibly different letters. The parcels are given the letters A to I, and the letter awarded determines the amount of port wine that can be made from the parcel, with A denoting the vineyards of the highest quality and therefore those that can produce the most port wine. Vineyards with a rating below F cannot make port wine, but can be used to make unfortified wine or distilled into spirits. The amount of must that can be produced is different every year. It is agreed between the 3 main bodies, the growers, the producers, and the IVDP, and takes into consideration the market demand as well as current stocks available in the market. The aim of the beneficio system is to keep grape and wine prices stable through its influence on the balance of supply and demand. Each owner of land is given a card or certificate for each parcel of land that they own. Vineyard owners are legally permitted to trade their beneficio cards, provided that the grapes from the parcel of land are traded alongside the card. In reality, this does not always happen. The grapes that are traded may not always come from that parcel of land. The beneficio sets the prices of grapes used for port, and these prices are relatively high. 1.2 to 1.4 euros for grapes within the beneficio system, 0.25 to 0.4 euros for grapes outside the beneficio system. As vineyard owners can be certain of a set high price for their beneficio grapes, there is much incentive to give lesser quality grapes with any trading of beneficio cards, retaining the best quality grapes for selling outside the beneficio system. Without any controls on price, high quality grapes are likely to receive a higher price than lower quality grapes. On the other side, sometimes port producers will substitute the inferior grapes they have received from beneficio trading with high quality grapes sourced from their own vineyards that are not part of their beneficio allocation to raise the quality of their port wines. The inferior grapes may be used or resold for unfortified wines. Many growers do not make their own port and make their money purely through beneficio trading. This means that a large amount of beneficio trading is conducted each year. All transactions and payments must be recorded by and made through the IVDP, which monitors and controls the process. The beneficio system is a subject of much debate, and a number of producers feel that it does not benefit the current industry. As demand for port has declined, the volume of port permitted to be produced has been reduced to avoid oversupply. At the same time, the total area of vineyards has been allowed to grow, leading to oversupply of grapes for unfortified Douro wines compared to market demand. As prices for these grapes are not fixed by the beneficio, the oversupply has led to very low prices. A number of port producers therefore feel that they are subsidizing the industry for unfortified Douro wines by paying artificially high prices for port grapes. Port sales. Port production in 2020 was approximately 70 million liters with sales of 68 million liters. After 3 decades of growth at the end of the 20th century, sales peaked at the millennium and have been steadily declining since. However, there has been an increase in average price due to an increasing sales of premium wines such as age-indicated tawny ports, in turn thought to be attributed to increasing quality of production and effective marketing of premium products. The IVDP separates port wines into standard ruby, tawny, white, and rosé, and special categories, which includes all wines above this basic standard, e.g., reserve ruby, tawny, and white. Tawny and white with an indication of age, colheita, vintage, single quinta, crusted, and LBV. Wines in the special categories make up approximately 23% of volume sales, but 45% of sales by value. In 2019, around 87% of port sales by volume came from export markets. France is the largest market by volume. The domestic Portuguese market is the second largest market, particularly for inexpensive styles of port, which are drunk as an aperitif. The decline in sales volume of port is mainly due to dropping demand for inexpensive port in markets such as France and Holland, as other beverages are increasingly being drank as aperitifs. A number of port producers have diversified into still unfortified wines, including Symington, Quinta de Noval, Ramos Pinto, and Newport, whereas others, such as Taylor's, have continued to focus solely on port. It is hoped that the growing popularity of Douro wines may introduce new consumers to port wines, particularly in countries that have not been traditional markets for port. Rosé and unaged white ports also aim to bring new drinkers into the category. Rosé port can be drunk as an aperitif, but it is also marketed for use in cocktails. White port is also sometimes used in cocktails, but it is also mixed with tonic as an aperitif. Its lower alcohol concentration than many spirits and mixers, such as gin and tonic, may be a positive attribute for some consumers. Further potential is also seen for premium red ports in the hospitality sector. Graham's have launched a number of 4.5-liter bottles of various tawny ports that can be presented to dining customers as a digestif, a perfect photo opportunity for sharing on social media. End of Chapter 3.